excellent questions about agency. Have you ever heard the saying, you can't teach an old dog new tricks? Sometimes I feel that way about the texts we get on Sunday morning. Now that I'm preaching every week, you see on internship it was once a month, I sometimes fear the familiar instead of the unknown. I'm afraid that when texts come around yet again in our lectionary that I will find nothing new there, that the familiar will become stale and unhelpful. Well, we've arrived at the end of our series on healing, and I don't know how you have experienced these texts held together 4 weeks in a row under the subheading Healing, but I've encountered many of these familiar stories in new ways. Though these stories repeat every 3 years, and in some cases even more frequently, I believe these stories still have something meaningful to say for our lives. God is still working new things in the old standards. The story of the Gerasene demoniac might be familiar for some of us. For some, we might remember the name Legion, which is the name that the demons inside this man give themselves. Some of us might remember the pigs, into whom the demons are exorcised and then run into the water to drown. Some of us might remember the results of the healing vest, as this man so far removed from his humanity finds it again in an instant. This particular go-round, I am drawn particularly to the ways in which this possessed man is treated by his friends and family. You see, we are called to encounter God's beloved children with compassion, with courage, with love and hope. And this is not how people treated this man possessed by Legion. This man had been bound in chains by those who cared for him. And now that he had broken free to wander the countryside, not welcome in a home any longer, but welcome in a tomb. The swineherders simply observed him from a distance, afraid to venture closer. In this man's time of need, this possessed man encountered fear instead of courage, despair instead of hope, loneliness instead of community, violence instead of love, and shame instead of understanding. To me, this story represents both the struggles and the stigmas of mental illness. See, mental illness is oftentimes viewed callously, without feeling or with confusion by some. Human beings, we like to be able to see what we're about. We like to point with precision and certainty to a cause and an effect. And mental illness pushes back on these securities. When we encounter mental illness, either in ourselves or in others, our first reaction might be judgment, because it's not something well understood by the general populace, and the cause and effects are relatively invisible. We might say things like, well, it's all in his head. And when we respond in this way and judge the illness to be self-inflicted, we are not responding with compassion and understanding. You see, the truth is, people who suffer with mental illness or disorders are as vulnerable to it as our bodies are to disease. I think of my dad, who suffers from clinical depression. People around him think depression is simply being sad all the time, or having a bad attitude, or being lazy. They tell him to snap out of it, to try hard, to find something fun to do. It's his own fault that he's depressed. See, what they don't understand is that clinical depression, just like any other mental illness or disorder, isn't controlled by will or effort. Just as we can't will away diabetes from a body, so too does mental illness control the process and effects of the mind. Remember the man from our story today, possessed by Legion. At the mercy of this invisible yet all-controlling power inside of him, he no longer knows himself, much less do his friends and family see him. Rather, in the eyes of the people around him, this man has been reduced to the demon's evidence. The anger, the violence, the abuse, the aggression, the indecency, the obsession with death, and the wildness. His friends and family react to these symptoms and treat the man not with compassion and understanding, but rather with fear and isolation. They put their friend in chains. They shackled him away from others. They no longer see their friend, they only see the demon. He's no longer a human being, he is only legion. This man exemplifies the sort of dehumanizing stigmas that accompany mental illness. Christ, in his humanity, has shown us what it is to be human, what it is to be in the image of God. Humanity is kind, courageous, generous, forgiving, understanding, and loving. But we see in this story that the evils of possession, the evils of disease, and in particular mental illness, darken our perspective and challenge us. Not only does the man encounter violence, hate, and solitude because of legion, but also his friends and family encounter and even embody violence, hate, and solitude as they shackle him in chains and as they no longer welcome him in their community. I hardly think it was a joyful or hopeful prospect for them to shackle the loved one with chains and confine him to solitude. I hardly think it was preferable to keep a safe distance from a man who grew up with them in the same town, who shared in the same celebrations and funerals as the rest. I hardly think anyone enjoyed keeping guard over this man so that he didn't become harmful to himself or others. No, I don't think fear and violence was anybody's first choice in responding to this man's possession. Instead, I think people felt compelled. Often, I think, in the midst of hardship and in the midst of the unknown, the fear and violence seem the only avenues for change. When we don't know how to respond or even understand what exactly is going on, our fight or flight instincts kick in. It became time for the city to defend itself against legion. It became time to protect itself from the influence of this possession. It became time to give up hope that the man still existed behind the demons. But Jesus shows us something different. Jesus shows us just how to encounter people in need, even when we don't understand what exactly is going on. Jesus shows us that possession and mental illness does not need to rob us or others of our humanity, does not need to rob us of our rights to love, compassion, and community. Jesus approaches the demoniac with courage and without judgment, with compassion and curiosity, and with an invincible hope that the man still existed behind the demons, that this man's work still existed behind the demons. Friends, if we take anything away from today's text, or even these four regarding healing, I hope that we have found a way to compassion, a God deeply interested in our well-being, and a challenge to care for those that no one else will care for. I can't help but wonder at the horrific events in Orlando when someone took the lives of 49 individuals and robbed even more of security and loving relationships. As we grieve the victims of the massacre at the Pulse nightclub, we find ourselves angry or sad at yet another show of intolerance and hate towards our LGBT brothers and sisters. As we reevaluate our barriers to gun possession, and as we care for the wounded, we must also grieve the violence and the death of the gunmen, whose demons were many. Our world is possessed of demons that perpetuate violence, stigma, prejudice, and hate. And yet, we are called, as Jesus, to encounter each with compassion. We are called to seek out the intolerable, the stigmatized, the disassociated, the lowly, the ill, the grieving, the despised, and the outcast. It will take courage to encounter with compassion. And it may be difficult to understand what exactly is going on. But in whatever situations we find ourselves, we are challenged to engage with compassion, to love our neighbors as we love ourselves, and to seek out understanding when we don't know what exactly is going on. May you leave this place understood by our God and by our community here. May you leave this place filled with the compassion and the love of God so that you might share it with the world. May you leave this place excited to seek out and learn about the marginalized, the stigmatized, and misunderstood people around us. May you leave this place healed and healing. Amen.